So once again, we sit down for another conversation that we at least call Attempted Intelligence, and we attempt to be intelligent. So what we're going to do this time is consider the concept of ontology. And the concept of ontology as utilized in science, not as utilized in philosophy, essentially a classification system that allows you to classification system with a preferential domain of reality, which could be a quantity, it could be a quality, right? Numbers, letters, whatever you want to use. Consider classification system with a preferential domain of reality that allows for comparison of things. So classification and comparison. And in that classification system, there is a discriminatory nature and discriminatory meaning the ability to differentiate between things.
Right.
I would say that word in its neutral use doesn't mean anything good or bad. It just means telling apart.
Yes.
But if we use discriminatory in the current social context, I would say that there's a higher likelihood that you will see that as a negative term.
Right.
Okay. That's not how I'm using it. It's just the ability to tell things apart.
Right.
Okay. Now, what I want to attempt to do is look at where a classification system has been used in a given way, and then there have been changes in it that maybe we may find some levity or humor in.
Okay.
Maybe.
Right, just in the comparison of how it changed.
Yeah. So they thought that way. Yes, they did, and lots of good reasons for them. So the one that I had introduced to you through an interesting historical video last week was the idea of how Romans, or how one way that Romans attempted to classify people from different places. Right? So what they did is not what they did. What was done within the Roman Empire in the historical record is an attempt to classify the differences between people based on climate, right? So people from
the climate of their region.
Well, the climate period.
Okay.
Right. So if you are from a different climate, there's a difference between you and somebody who's from a different climate.
Okay.
So the central assumption was that the sun impacted intelligence, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
So if you were from the northern regions or the northern climate region, you were considered larger physically. You were considered less intelligent, and you were considered very brave, right? If you were from the southern climate region, keeping in mind that the Roman understanding of the globe at the time maybe didn't go all that far south, right. They would have definitely been in the region that would be called Nubia, right? So south of Egypt.
Okay.
I believe they would have been in what would have been modern day Ethiopia, or had understanding and trade with. They probably didn't necessarily. So Carthage was essentially largely northern Africa, but they probably didn't go into the desert regions much, and I don't believe they sailed out of the Mediterranean and south often. So really, if you looked at what's green on on the east of Africa, they probably went some portion there.
Right.
But further south, if you were from further south, you were considered physically smaller in stature, very intelligent, but not brave.
Right.
And the Romans would have been in the intermediate climate zone, which meant that they had a good mix of all these characteristics, which is why they were well balanced and well suited to rule the world. Right. But the central assumption of that classification system was that depending on the amount of sun that you were exposed to, based on where you were from, it would impact characteristics about you. This maybe got mapped further, then you would see Romans making fun of people who wore pants. Right, you saw the video, right?
I did see that.
There was you wear pants. What you slovenly heathen wearing pants?
Barbarians.
Yeah. The other one was I feel like it was the Goths, who were, I believe, from a region in Europe that was further north of what would be considered Rome or the Roman heartland, and they would wear shoes.
Right.
And they'd make fun of people who wore shoes. Shoes covering your toes. Who does that? Right? It's like, well, we come from a place where maybe it's a little on the cold side, and also, some things might cut your feet.
General protection.
I don't know. But you were looked down upon for covering your toes.
Right.
Right? So we can say that in the modern scheme...
But they would also use that as a classification to go, you're from this area because you're wearing...
So the classification that they would have, the differentiation, the explanatory mechanism was climate.
Okay.
The way that they would identify you was through culture. Right? So through shared ideas and shared behaviors. It wouldn't matter how you superficially looked. So your skin tone didn't matter as much as the clothes you wore, the language you spoke, and the foods you ate and the way you behaved. Right? So maybe the way you washed something could impact, right? It's like, oh, that's where you're from. Okay. So you could be somebody who was from a southern climate with a darker skin tone, but you grew up in a Germanic region. So you wore Germanic clothes, right? You had Germanic mannerisms. You were German.
Right.
They would classify you based on essentially what we could call cultural cues, right? So that was that was how they differentiated. That's how they would assume where you were from. So let's just say you were from a region, a northern European region, right? But you wanted to mess with some Romans, and you wore clothes as if you were from Nubia. And spoke a Nubian language, because many people would have been multilingual. But you spoke a Nubian language and wore Nubian clothing, but you were, a really tall Swede. What we would call a Swede today, right? He said, "That is a very interesting Nubian."
It's an interesting mix.
Well, not mix. It could be an interesting Nubian, but the classification system would be based on cultural cues, right? Superficial cultural cues, not necessarily color, not necessarily. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist and they didn't notice it, but they wouldn't classify it.
See a Nubian that looks like this.
No, but he's clearly a Nubian. He must have been a slave. The Nubians must have captured him and taught him their ways. So you see that there's a classification system. So there's an explanatory mechanism that uses the presence or absence or intensity of the sun as an explanatory classification system for the differences between people. And then there would be the way that we would tell each other apart, which is by dress and by language, something like that. So that's one way in which the classification system was a certain way, and maybe today we do not consider it the same way. However, what you're really looking at in differentiating people broadly, so if you zoom out, the classification system is in-group and out-group. In-group are people who do things that you believe that you do, and are from something similar to where you're from, therefore they're in the group, and then you're outside of the group. So there's different ways to do that.
You're wearing pants, you're wearing shoes, you're definitely the out groups.
Yes, in that system. So the details are different, right? So the details of the classification system are one thing. The same phenomena, the central classification system is in-group and out-group. And everybody does this, right? To varying degrees in varying levels of their life. So that classification system is stable, but the details of the classification system that the Roman used to tell people apart, the details have changed. Right? However, something that might happen today is that we can carry a classification system of where somebody's from, and should they choose to wear clothes that are not what most people would consider what they're from, like where they would fit as far as their group, then there have been times when it would be considered parody or mockery, right? There were times where it would be considered, you're trying to understand my culture, and then there are times when it said, essentially, you could call it a cultural appropriation, but the same behavior, wearing the garb of a different group, can have you seen negatively or seen positively. Right? So it becomes interesting because you can see the ebb and flow of that.
I was going to say, there's a factor that kind of, just carrying over as well, just using those as classifications and identifiers.
So there's an ebb and flow, right? William Adams, the samurai. Right. So William Adams, the English navigator, I don't remember the Japanese. I don't remember the shogun's name, but it was one. I think it was the first shogun after the Sengoku Jidai, which was the period of warring states.
You gotta relax.
Anyways, what he really liked William Adams, and he was upset at the Portuguese because the Portuguese seemed to, in their business dealings with the Japanese, be trying to kind of control stuff too much. And then William Adams, this English cat, shows up and is like, yeah, no, that's not entirely true. There's other stuff. So he basically gave William Adams the position of being samurai, or being in the samurai class, which was essentially like a high-level administrator class. It had warrior ethos, it had warrior training, but basically you were like a lord, like under the big lord, so like a knightly class. Most people might understand knight better, to maybe draw the comparison. But he gave him a small fiefdom, so he gave him land, and he gave him female companionship. And he said, when he gave him the two ceremonial swords, so the long sword and the short sword, he said, William Adams is dead, Miura Anjin is born, so now you have a Japanese name, you wear Japanese clothes, you stay and you do what I like. Right? So that could be an example of where somebody suggesting you change your clothing, you change your mannerisms, is inviting you in to their classification, into their group,
I was gonna say that
by wearing their clothes. Right? And he clearly looked different than them. But they're like, you wear Japanese clothes, you hold Japanese swords, you have Japanese land, you're one of us. Right? So yeah, you're different and stuff, but you're in our group. Right? So that can be an interesting idea. But again, the classification system. Right? So if we have a classification system that says the clothes you wear, the language you speak, the way you act, the things you say, when you say them, how you say them, that it makes you part of the group or outside the group. Right? And then the details of that changes. So that can be evidenced through the Romans, through William Adams, and through others. So I said, hey, find some stuff. And you're like, well, I don't know if I found anything.
Well, I was trying very hard to find some stuff.
And then you told me what it was, and I said, that sounds cool.
One of them was the belief was probably closer to the 1600s, where the belief was that tomatoes were classified as a poisonous fruit.
Now, where was this?
I did not see specifically where it was.
Like, what part of the world would they have believed this? Would they have believed this in Central America? Would they have believed this in North America? Would they have believed this in Europe and China?
Where I was looking at it, it seemed closer to like a Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If I'm not mistaken, tomatoes are primarily, their origins are primarily Central America. So I believe most people would claim Mexico, but I believe it's Central America. And then it would have spread after exploratory contact in that time frame.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they were classifying tomatoes as poisonous because it was a new food that was introduced into the collection.
That was probably Europe.
The collection of food. So as they were eating the tomatoes, everyone who really consumed tomatoes inside like an eating place, whether they were in their house or at some place where they were serving food, they were getting sick, and they would get sick and die. So they just classified tomatoes as poisonous. And they later found out that the tableware, the plates and everything that they were using were made of lead, and the high acidity from the tomatoes was drawing out some of the lead and giving people lead poisoning.
Yeah, so it was essentially the interaction between the tomato and the lead dining ware.
Yes.
Right. Sure. The lead dining ware created a situation where the lead was more easily transferred into the human.
Right.
So, and you wouldn't initially have assumed it to be poisonous because you took it from an area where people ate it with what you would consider some regularity. Right. And you bring it over and all of a sudden people die. So I guess tomatoes in Europe are deadly, right? But tomatoes in wherever they're from, I don't know what happened.
Exactly.
So the classification system is the advice would have been don't eat tomatoes, they'll kill you, right? Or they'll maybe not kill you, but they'll make you vomit and possibly have diarrhea and other issues, and
it could lead to death.
I think lead poisoning often does.
Yes.
Right? Lead poisoning, teeth fall out?
I'm not sure.
I feel like it. But, I think a lot of things make teeth fall out. Right. So the idea being that the classification system there was because you saw a behavioral and temporal correlation between
Yes.
eating tomatoes and ill health,
Right.
then tomatoes are poison. So the classification system is it's the tomatoes,
Right.
So based on using time frame and behavior and bringing them together, tomatoes are poisonous. Now, when we say, are we sure? Because we see people eating tomatoes somewhere else, this doesn't happen. And then they're able to say, so the initial classification system that they're using is related time, related behavior, right? And then what they see is in another place, those two things don't produce the same result.
Right.
Therefore, we need to reconsider. Because if you stay on tomatoes are poisonous, you'll never figure out it could be the lead dining ware.
And this is exactly what I didn't see when I was looking into the information and understanding that it does kind of apply to this topic that we're talking about in the kind of shift or look at classification.
Yeah.
And in bringing it up to you and you kind of highlighting or emphasizing that classification of poisonous fruit versus poisonous thing or poison in general does change it.
Yeah, so it's they're looking at the outcome. So the outcome is there's some form of interaction that would be termed poison.
Right.
And they're looking a step back and they're saying, well, what was the related behavior and the related time frame?
Right.
And they seem to see tomatoes.
Right.
That's the thing that they can see. Well, because at no other time are we able to identify that something that we eat off of this
same
dining ware is doing that, because we don't understand a property of the tomato.
Right.
So we then say, okay, tomatoes classified as poison, but what we're not seeing is it's because of an interaction between those things.
Right.
So realistically, it's actually, in a lot of cases, not the dining ware, it's not the tomato, it's the combination of the two.
Right.
It's the emergent property of the mixture of the two.
Yeah.
And they would have never figured out that the lead was a problem had they not had tomatoes.
Right, on the plates.
Right, so the initial classification system is tomatoes are poisonous, then they figure out over time, because they reconsider the classification
Right.
of tomatoes as poisonous, because they probably got information saying, well, over there they eat them and nothing happens.
Right.
Or maybe somebody ate it off of wood dining ware
something
or
else.
porcelain dining ware, right? What have
Or
you.
just straight off the tray.
Yeah. but
The vine, sorry.
Well, the vine. Yeah. So, but you see that as a classification where it didn't allow you to see the details.
Right.
And was there any other that you found interesting enough to share?
There was one about pirates, but I didn't get enough information.
Okay.
But it was very much just the definition of a pirate, how people were seeing pirates. And it was very much that they were criminals. They came from some type of dark, underseated world, underground world, and they went out to sea and just started doing horrible things to people.
As far as you're aware, is that how people saw them at the time, or is that maybe what you could call a post hoc or an after the fact painting or caricature?
I feel like it's a very much after the fact kind of deal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair, because what else did you get from what you read? Because I don't want to absolutely interject and totally guide it, but what else did you get from what you read?
Well, I did get other information that this, because again, not seeing the clear classifications as I was reading, but also that it wasn't necessarily true. There were different people for different reasons doing different things, and at the time, really the people that saw this, they were the ones being told about it. They weren't the ones experiencing it.
Yes.
Right?
Sure.
So there was a lot of different groups of people for different reasons doing piracy.
Yeah, and what's the general definition of piracy as you were able to find?
Oh, the one that I found was an individual who...
I don't know how it would be an individual, because it was a ship.
Well, it was just a person who basically robs or steals on the sea or near shore.
Okay. Well, with the possibility of being wet.
Yeah.
So the thing that I interjected in is that at least in the era that we would currently extract the concept of piracy or the caricature of piracy, what it really was what's called a privateer.
Okay.
Right, and what they were is people who had ships, right? They had ships and they were from varying countries, and they would be more or less commissioned by their governmental authority to steal from ships that were carrying goods for other governments. So by commission of the Queen, an English sailor, an English captain with a ship, they would drop the English flag or the British flag or whatever it happened to be at the time, and they would fly another flag, and sometimes it would be skull and crossbones. So they'd tell you, we're coming to steal your stuff. And what they would do, so the English would see a Dutch ship, and they'd drop flag and throw up some form of other flag that would signal we're coming. They'd go steal their stuff and take that as spoils. So it was essentially government-sanctioned theft.
I was going to say theft.
Right? Then, if you look further back in history, you're going to consistently see something like this. I don't remember the time frame, but there was another person or another video that I introduced to you that was talking about a pirate in southern China, or the South China Sea, Koxinga. So Koxinga, I don't know if I can't remember if Koxinga inherited a bit of a fleet from a parent, like from his father, or if it was something else. But anyways, essentially, initially, the Dutch East Indies Company saw this person with a bunch of fleets, like with a bunch of ships, and said, "Hey, you want to be a privateer for us?" And said, "Sure, I'll be a privateer for you." So the Dutch East Indies Company provided Koxinga with African musketeers, so people from Africa who had muskets and were good at shooting.
Okay.
Then they also somehow provided Koxinga with Japanese samurai.
Okay.
Right, so they were probably Ronin or people of the samurai class with fighting skill who were not employed by a lord.
Fair enough.
Right. Then, so Koxinga pirated for the Dutch East Indies Company and said, "Hey, why am I doing it for these people? I'm going to go do it for China." All right, so that's just kind of stories and details where, but the idea being somebody had access to
a ship,
sailing ships, many, and then had a relationship, was sanctioned, right? So it becomes an interesting set of details within the story where it's not just somebody who said, I magically have a boat and I'm going to be Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean, right? And if you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, even Orlando Bloom's character, what's that guy's name?
I can't remember.
Whatever. But Orlando Bloom's character.
Yeah.
He was like being an English officer, and then just by chance, some weird stuff happened, and he's like, "I guess I gotta go with Jack Sparrow." So you see some of the possible detail there. But the caricature of the term pirate that we have today is just somebody who wears a very specific set of clothing and is a wild person and just likes violence. Right? It's like, no, that's not what happened. And my understanding is that a fair amount of people who would have been commissioned by governmental authorities as privateers didn't stay that way. The one who, I really don't think your dad talked to you much about Jamaica.
No.
But the Captain Morgan in Jamaica is very rarely called Captain Morgan. It's Pirate Morgan.
Okay.
Because Captain Morgan was a privateer who I think eventually had the highest governmental authority, governor. I think was the governor of the colony of Jamaica. Right. So privateer turned governor of Jamaica, and not looked highly upon in Jamaica at all. Still to this day, Pirate Morgan. Right. I don't know of many people that I've experienced who are from Jamaica who have any positive opinion. And to the point where this is several hundred years ago, it's still one of those things. That's a name you spit on.
Wow.
Like that. Wow. Right. But so the simple classification system of somebody who steals, it's not the detail, right? So the classification system so you have a term and then all of a sudden there's assumptions made in relation to that. This is how we classify them. They wear these kind of weird clothes. Some of them are missing limbs and have hooks and peg legs, and they have parrots. There's always parrots, right?
Patches, they are a lot.
Yeah. Okay. But these are caricatures, and that's the classification system that we attach to the word. But that's not the appropriate classification system. The appropriate classification system may have more complexity.
Yes.
Right? So if you stick with the simple one, you miss the other details. So I think the primary point is, depending on how you classify something, it will constrain what you're able to find.
Yes.
So if you're looking for colors, and your preferential domain of reality is numbers, superficially you're going to have a hard time finding it. However, if you know about hexadecimal,
Yes.
because hexadecimal apparently is a system of notation that can intone a particular color in a mathematical fashion. Therefore, if you use numbers, maybe you can find, I don't know.
Right.
I don't necessarily know how that system does that, but I know that it exists. So there's hexadecimal notation which relates to color.
Right.
Right? And if you know what it is, and that's mauve, that's purple. Okay.
But the other thing is, it's challenging to compare those. So if you're using numbers to classify colors, and you're looking at a color,
So,
It won't
but if
necessarily-
you're comparing color to color,
right,
easy. But if it's hexadecimal to hexadecimal, if you know the system,
right,
it's easy.
right,
Well, I feel like it would be if I knew what it was. But I don't. So kind of, sort of. But the idea being that if you choose an whatever classification system you choose, you constrain the possibility of outcomes.
right.
Right. It doesn't mean you won't find you won't find something, but
Just limits it.
it limits it. It constrains it. Right. So just as an epistemology or a theory of knowledge or a theory of truth would, and the methods that would then be associated with it would constrain the types of things that you would find. Right. Then an ontology, a classification system, you're not going to find something that falls outside of the lens of it.
Right.
Right. So sometimes also what you get though is you've got the right lens, you just put it in the wrong place. So sometimes you should probably try to move your lens every once in a while, and then if you moved it a few times, like not working. Maybe I just need a new lens. Right. So my essential point in a lot of these conversations isn't to say that one epistemology or one ontology is the best. What I'm saying is that they all constrain. Because they all constrain, we should have at least some cursory understanding of most of them and be willing to use many of them to investigate the things that they're appropriate for investigating. And not just that, maybe try on one that you wouldn't think is appropriate for investigating it and see what happens. Because you might find something cool. So basically,
But it also might just reinforce what you were like. If you were looking in one way and it doesn't go that way, you go, okay, so it doesn't work that way, and then you can continue. Right, you can continue with the lens you have.
So it's essentially an iterative process. So you restart from the point you left off.
Yes.
You learn something and you restart. You learn something and you restart. So again, as stated another way, something that I like to communicate as best as I can is there is not one way to do science. There are many ways to do science, all of which have strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
So if we only use one of them, or we try to make a hierarchy and say one is better, then we miss out on all the other opportunities for investigation. What I would say, hopefully, is we use them all in as many ways as we're able, which would give us a broader picture.
So this might be a larger question than I actually want it to be, but just looking at the discussion topic that we're talking about now, is ontology and classification, and having a classification and understanding and looking at how classification has changed over time, sorry, not classification, but classification of specific things has changed, and we're looking at it with a new lens. Should we continually or constantly be looking at classifications? Like, one of the things that kind of came up to me when I was reading was we often use classifications but don't actually question the classification itself.
Yeah, so that's what why I suggest reconsidering everything, or what I call an appropriate amount of uncertainty, is to say there's based on human history and what I'm able to understand about it, it's almost impossible for any of us to be correct.
Right.
We're going in the right direction,
Right.
and we're figuring things out. And it's not necessarily one of those things where it's like question everything, because then you just become a peanut gallery. You're just being a jerk all the time. Well, are you sure? Like, no.
But then it never,
That's just challenging for the sake of challenging.
Right.
But to say, okay, I have a set of desire, I have a question of interest, trying to figure out something, and I'm getting no results. I'm getting nothing. I'm really convinced that there's something happening here, but the way that I'm looking at it, I'm getting nothing.
Yeah.
So I would say be willing at all times to reconsider your classification system. Not just that, what I would say is operate from the position of none of the classification systems that exist as we understand them in the moment are complete. None of them. So I figured out that it's not my card, it's the camera. So I use a DSLR, and they don't record for over 30 minutes because there's some international law that says if it's going to be a camera,
Right.
it can only record for 30 minutes. If it's a camcorder, beyond 30 minutes. Anyways, so limitations, scientific papers,
Yes.
the limitations section, and they'll talk about the limitations of the methods. They'll talk about possible biases of the investigators, but very rarely do you see the limitations of the investigation,
Right.
so the epistemology or the ontology. And to me, my guess is, under the current circumstances, the limitations of an epistemology or an ontology are considered implicit. Well, you should know them, so that's why. However, what I would say is that I wouldn't call them that. I wouldn't call them implicit. I think there's value in them being more explicit. The limitations of any epistemology and any ontology should be more broadly discussed overall, or specifically included in an investigation process.
Okay. Yeah, I think it just, the way that you stated that, it just takes this the summary, gives it detail, and explains it perfectly. Yeah.
Okay.
I like that.
Well, that's nice. you like remember what I say about things that you resonate with?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just, they're pulling on your dumb strings, so be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think they're pulling on your dumb strings in this case, because clearly I think that I'm on, but I might not be. So whatever. Anything else to add currently?
No.
Fantastic.